Okay, this is part 3. So part 1, stripping out all the markup and the cascading style sheet information that was no longer needed. Part 2, marking up logical areas in the document. Part 3, this introduce CSS structure for us to actually use, so we can introduce some styles and get the styles back into the document. So I'm going to create an overall CSS file, and later on I'll talk about normalizing the CSS file and what that's all about. There are 3 ways to attach styles, and there's inline, internal and external. We're not going to use the first 2 because external style sheets are the way to go. All professional corporate sites use external style sheets. You place all your style information into a single or a series of single files, and then if any changes have to occur, we can make those changes in that single file, and it will apply to the hundreds of web pages that use those style files. That's the way we should do it. So we need to add a link tag to the top of the HTML document, and I'm going to put a link in, and it's going to link to a file called styles.css. Now in this example I'm placing all the files in one folder to make it work, but in reality, of course, you might have all your style files in a particular folder, you might have your images in a particular subfolder. You'd have to change the links inside the href attribute to make that work, but to keep things nice and simple here, and in the files that you download when you play around with this stuff, everything should be in the same folder. So here's a link that goes from the HTML file to a file called styles.css, and that's very familiar. It's like all the examples that we've seen so far, but it will be slightly different from this point on, because rather than placing all the style information into a single file, what I'm going to do is split the style information into different files. Now the advantage of doing that is that clearly for a complex site you could have lots and lots of style information. If we place it all in a single file, it can be quite confusing when it comes to revising the styles at a later point. So in fact, we're going to use 4 files. There's a normalizing file, which I'll talk about in a minute. There's a file for layout, and inside there we're going to place information, style information to do with resizing columns and column placements, margin and padding and things like that. There's a color style file, and in there obviously we place all the color information about fonts and backgrounds and all that stuff. And then there's a 4th style file, which is for the typography of the website. You know, what fonts we're using, where on the website, things like that. So the normalizing file is the first one, and that's going to reset the default styles. Layout is for column and row layout, as I've mentioned. Font, block and element color goes in the color file. Don't forget the American spelling of color. And then there's the typography one, which contains the font types. So the original FOB semantic HTML file has the link to the styles file. Our styles file has to have some kind of way of importing our 4 CSS files. And the way that we can do that is actually to use this command @import URL, and then in brackets we place the file name. Now there's no quotes required here. So we can simply create a styles file that's got those 4 lines inside. And the order is important here because this is the order these things will be read in. And for reasons that will become apparent in a moment, the normalized file has to be the one at the top. So what's normalizing all about? Well, the thing about different browsers is that they have slightly different default styles for the elements that we know that are used all the time. So headings, paragraphs, all these things have a default style of a certain amount of margin, a certain amount of padding, what default font will be used. But the trouble is that there might be slight variations in those things. So if you bring up a page in Firefox or Safari, it might look slightly different, only slightly different, to Internet Explorer. So one of the techniques that's being used quite frequently is to use a normalizing file. And what the normalizing file is, it basically sets all the style information to 0. It removes all the margins and the paddings, and it changes all the sizes down to a standard size so that you're sort of at a ground level. so that the site would look exactly the same in every single browser. And then what we do is we apply our CSS on top of the normalizing effects so that we know that the site will look the same in whichever browser we bring it up in. Now you don't have to write your own normalizing file, there's loads of them out there if you search on the web. Here's an example of one. You can see that basically what it does is it sets margins and paddings to 0, sets font sizes for the H elements to be the same, and it goes on. And as I said, there's lots of ones out there. You can get one from Yahoo, or you can go to these URLs to download them. There's certainly one in these zip files that you'll download. Obviously, if you get a different normalizing file from different people, they'll have a different technique, they'll use different rules. So this is what the file looks like with the default style information that's just coming through. If you have a look at the welcome heading, you can see there's a bit of padding around it, and you can see the layout around the paragraphs. So let's apply the normalizing file and see what happens. There you go, you can see it set all the fonts to be about the same size, and it's compressed all the margins and paddings. So obviously the next big step after this is to try and reintroduce all the style information that we need to make the site look good. And that's in the next bit. Obviously that's the big part of this, creating the layout, adding colour, typography information into those separate CSS files.